Well, welcome to our online experience. Let me start with a question. Have you ever been at the front of a church like this? Maybe some would call it an altar, where you were at the front, kneeling down, or maybe you were in a seat, sitting when a speaker asked you to take a step of faith, a sacrifice. But not a sacrifice with goats or rituals, but the personal decision to say yes to God, to follow Him wherever He leads, even if it means giving something up. See, that kind of choice often comes with sacrifice. Sometimes it means laying down our own plans, our comforts, or what we thought we wanted. But looking back, we realize those decisions often led us to something far greater, God's best. See, today I want to invite you into that kind of life, to choose Jesus by choosing His way. It's not always the easiest path, but it is the most fulfilling one. Generations of people have discovered that God's way really is the better way. People have launched churches all over the world for the past 2,000 years. My name is Jeff, one of the pastors here at the Point Church, and today, Pastor Nate will help us process what it could mean to discover more about what it means to live the Jesus way. And first, I want to invite you to sing with us, with our worship team, as we sing a song called The Jesus Way.
If you curse me, then I will bless you. If you hurt me, I will forgive. And if you hate me, then I will love you. I choose the Jesus way. If you're hopeless, I will defend you. And if you're burdened, I'll share the weight. And if you're hopeless, then let me show you there's hope in the Jesus way. I follow Jesus. Jesus, He wore my sin, I'll gladly wear His name. He is the treasure, He is the answer. Oh, I choose the Jesus way. If you strike me, I will embrace you. And if you chain me, I'll sing His praise. And if you kill me, my home is heaven. For I choose the Jesus way. I follow Jesus. I follow Jesus. I choose surrender. I choose love. Oh God, my Savior, You'll always be enough. I choose forgiveness. Oh, I choose grace. I choose to worship no matter what I face. I choose the Jesus way. 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 I follow Jesus. I follow Jesus. He wore my sin, I'll gladly wear His name. He is the treasure. He is the answer. Oh, I choose the Jesus.
My son Finn has been playing t-ball for the last few years now, and he absolutely loves it. This past season, he really started to find his groove. He's become the kind of player who can throw with both hands and even switch hits at the plate. This season, though, has been my favorite because they no longer use the tee. The coaches now just lob the ball to them, so it's always exciting when he cracks one into the outfield. And Finn, he's been doing a pretty good job at it. Each time he makes solid contact, and you can see the confidence building in him. So much so that one day he wanted to challenge me. He thought he could hit the ball further than I could. So we went home and went outside, and he grabbed the bat, and I lobbed him the ball. And sure enough, he smacked it pretty good, and then it was my turn. He tossed the ball to me, and in that moment, I had a choice to make. Do I take it easy, just tap it, maybe send it barely farther than his ball so I don't crush his confidence, or do I swing for the fences and hit that tee-ball into oblivion and remind him who the big hitter in the family is? Which choice do you think I made? Yeah, I crushed it. I'm sorry, I had to. I sent it flying into the woods, and we still haven't found it at all to this day. That day, I didn't choose humility. I chose to humble my son, and most likely not the right response. But when it comes to choosing the Jesus way, we've been talking about different choices. Week 1, we talked about choosing surrender. Last week, week 2, we talked about choosing love. And today we're going to talk about choosing sacrifice, focusing in on humility. And specifically, I want us to focus on what it meant for Jesus to empty himself, as Paul writes about in the book of Philippians. Philippians chapter 2 is sometimes called the Christian hymn. It's poetic, it's almost creed-like, and many scholars believe it may have been an early hymn or confession that Paul included in this letter to the Philippians. It forms the theological center of this letter, and it gives us one of the clearest pictures in all of Scripture of who Jesus is and what he gave up and how far he was willing to go in sacrifice. And here's the challenge Paul lays out for us. The way Jesus sacrificed is the way we're called to sacrifice too. So I've broken this passage into 3 parts, and the first part is this. Sacrifice begins with humility. Paul begins in verse 5 with this. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Now, Philippi was a Roman colony in Macedonia. Most of the people there were retired Roman soldiers and proud of their citizenship, steeped into Roman culture. And Roman culture did not value humility. It was actually the opposite. They valued honor and status and power. Humility wasn't seen as a virtue. It was a weakness. It was shameful. So Paul is writing something that sounds almost offensive to Roman ears. He says, if you follow Jesus, you have to adopt his mindset. And this mindset isn't intellectual. It's not about thinking the right thoughts. It's about a whole orientation of life. Then Paul explains what that mindset looks like in verse 6. He says this, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used in his own advantage. And that word nature in Greek, it means essential form, true nature. Paul is saying Jesus wasn't just like God. He wasn't simply God-like. He was in very nature, in very essence, God. This is critical. Before Paul describes Jesus' humility, he reminds us of his divinity. The one who stooped low was first seated high. And what did Jesus do with that position? Paul says he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Think about that, right? Equal with God. Same standing, same rights, same honor and authority. He had every right to cling to it. He did. Every right to wield it, but he didn't. That's humility. Now, compare this to the gods people worshipped at that time, right? The emperors themselves demanded worship. Caesar was called son of God. Coins bore that title. Citizens were required to proclaim Caesar is Lord, right? These emperors, they exalted themselves through conquest, fear, and domination. Their glory was in being served. The Greek gods of myth weren't any better, right? Their stories are full of pride and lust, revenge, and trickery. They used their power to exploit, not to serve. So when Paul describes Jesus, the one true God, he's describing something radical. Instead of grasping at privilege, Jesus laid it down. It would have made more sense to the people of Philippi if Jesus had come like Caesar, if he had leveraged his power to dominate. That's what they would have expected of a God, right? But Jesus turns that expectation upside down. And we see this kind of humility all throughout his life, many different ways, right? For right off the bat, we see him born in humility, not majesty. He could have come as a king in a palace. Instead, he came as a baby in a manger. From the very beginning, he chose obscurity and poverty. We see it the same way as when serving instead of being served. In Mark 10:45, it says, "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." That's his heart all throughout his life and ministry. Resisting temptation. We see in Matthew chapter 4 that Satan tempted him to use his divine power for personal advantage, right? To feed himself when he was hungry, to display his power, to seize kingdoms without the cross, and he simply refused. We saw him showing this through washing the disciples' feet. John 13, right? The master of the universe stoops to do the work of a household slave, right? Even for Judas, who would ultimately betray him. Submitting to the cross. Matthew 26:53, Jesus said he could call on legions of angels to rescue him, but he didn't. He embraced suffering. Let me give you a picture from my childhood. I grew up playing Super Mario Bros. 3. If you've played it or you heard of it, you might remember the P-Wing item. That little item gave you the power to fly through the entire level without touching the ground. No obstacles, no enemies, just float above it all. Now imagine playing the whole game with the P-Wing. Sure, you'd breeze through it, but you'd miss the struggle. You'd miss the growth. You'd miss the story of overcoming. Jesus had something far greater than a P-Wing, obviously. He had the equality with God. He could have soared above the pain, the betrayal, the weakness of humanity, but he didn't. He set it aside. He emptied himself. That's what makes his sacrifice so powerful. We read it in verse 7 where it says, "Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness." This is the Greek word where we get he emptied himself. Now, this doesn't mean that he stopped being God. It means that he set aside his rights and privileges. He veiled his glory. He chose limitation. He submitted to the human experience. And he didn't just look like a servant, right? But Paul says he took on the very nature of a servant. Just like he was in the very nature of God, he became in very nature a servant. The creator became the created. The master became the servant. Think about that just for a moment, right? The one who spoke galaxies into existence learned to speak human words, right? Just think about that for a moment. The one who formed the mountains may have stubbed his toe on one. The one who designed trees worked with his hands in Joseph's carpenter shop, maybe even smashing his thumb with a hammer, right? That's humility. That is sacrifice. So here's the point. Sacrifice begins with humility. Before Jesus gave up his life, he gave up his rights. Before he died on the cross, he chose the cradle, the carpenter's bench, the towel, the table, the road. The way of sacrifice always starts with laying down our pride and position. And if we want to follow Jesus, if we want to walk in the Jesus way, we have to start the same way. We're not clinging to our titles. We're not clinging to our rights. We're not clinging to our comforts, but emptying ourselves, choosing humility and serving others. And Paul continues this thought in verse 8. He says, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross." Wow. And this is where sacrifice moves from humility into obedience. And not shallow obedience, but obedience that presses deeper and deeper until it costs everything. Think about that. And being found in the appearance as a man. Paul wants us to understand that Jesus wasn't God in disguise. He didn't walk around glowing with glory. He was fully human, recognizable in every way. He ate, he drank, he slept, he worried, he cried. From the outside, right? He looked like any other Middle Eastern man of the first century. No halo, no heavenly glow, just a man. But think about what that means for us, right? The God who dwelt in unapproachable light, the God whose glory caused Moses' face to shine, the God whose presence filled the temple so powerfully the priest couldn't stand to minister. That God walked the streets of Nazareth in sandals. And people mistook him for another guy. That's humility. And that's a context for obedience. Right? We see that he humbled himself. Notice the wording here. This wasn't forced. Nobody pushed Jesus down. Nobody stripped him of his glory against his will. He humbled himself. He chose the low road. And in Romans, we said that humility wasn't a virtue. It was shameful. To be humbled was to be disgraced, but Jesus willingly embraced the lowest place. And this wasn't just a momentary act, it was a lifelong pattern. And here's where obedience enters in, right? By becoming obedient to death. Man, that phrase is stunning. Right? The eternal Son of God who commands angels, who spoke the universe into existence, chose to obey all the way to death. And Paul doesn't stop there. Right? He adds an exclamation point. Right? Even death on a cross. Not just death of an old age or some sickness. Not like that. Not just any death. Not a quiet death in old age. Not heroic death on the battlefield. But the most shameful, cursed death imaginable. Crucifixion. To the Romans, crucifixion was for slaves and rebels. To the Jews, cursed is anyone who hung on a tree, Deuteronomy 21:23. And Jesus obeyed to that point. Obedience deepens through sacrifice. Right? Here's the principle. Obedience without cost is shallow. Obedience tested by sacrifice is real. And obedience proven in sacrifice becomes witness. Let's walk this out for a moment, right? Obedience without a cost is shallow. It's easy to obey when it lines up with what you already want, doesn't it? If God calls me to love people who already love me back, that's not obedience tested. That's convenience. But shallow obedience doesn't shape us. It doesn't reveal Christ in us. It doesn't witness to the world. Sacrifice proves the depth of obedience. Jesus' obedience became clearest, not when he healed the sick or calmed the storms. Man, it became the clearest in Gethsemane. Not my will, but yours be done. Such a real and raw moment that he has with his Father in Luke 22:42. Man, that's the moment his obedience pressed all the way to the bottom. That's the moment it cost him everything. And every step he took toward Calvary proved the depth of that obedience. And then we have sacrifice transforms obedience into witness. Obedience can sometimes go unnoticed when it costs nothing, right? It can. But obedience with sacrifice shines like a spotlight. That's why Paul highlights even death on a cross. The cross is what makes his obedience breathtaking, right? The cross was not only his obedience to the Father, it was his witness to the world. It changed everything, right? And when we look through scriptures, we see different biblical examples, right, of this. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they obeyed God by refusing to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. It cost them the furnace, right? It cost them standing up. Chucked in there. But their sacrifice was a witness so powerful that even the king proclaimed God's greatness. And Stephen, in Acts chapter 7, he obeyed by proclaiming Jesus. It cost him his life, quite literally his life. But his sacrifice was a witness so strong that Saul, later Paul, stood there watching, and his life was forever marked. Paul in prison, right? Philippians chapter 1, his obedience led him to chains. His sacrifice gave others courage. Most of the brothers and sisters had become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear, he writes. That's an amazing experience, right? And not only does it happen in the Bible, we see everyday examples of this, right? Where a career in integrity, a Christian, a disciple, a follower of Jesus refuses to lie to get ahead. They sacrifice a promotion, but coworkers see that faithfulness is worth way more than success. Forgiveness in family, someone who forgives a deep wound. They sacrifice their right to revenge, right? But others see Christ in that radical grace. Generosity, right? A family cuts back on luxuries to give to missions. They sacrifice comfort, but their friends wonder, why would you even do that? And it opens the door to Jesus. We have students, right? You're choosing not to cheat or to gossip, even if it costs popularity, right? That obedience shines in a culture that is covered, that is riddled with compromise. And this shows up in her families too. I know my family, right? That when Ren shares a toy she really loves, not the one she's done playing with, but the one that she treasures. That's sacrifice, right? And that's when her obedience to me as her dad becomes visible to everyone around. When Finn plays baseball and chooses good sportsmanship, even when another kid is unfair, that's sacrifice. And that obedience becomes a witness to his coaches, his teammates, even other parents. Sacrifice is what turns private obedience into public witness. That's powerful, right? The world isn't impressed. They aren't by obedience that costs us nothing. But when obedience costs us time, when it costs us our money, our comfort, even reputation, that sacrifice shines like a spotlight on Jesus. That's when obedience turns into witness. But Paul doesn't end there, right? He reminds us that obedience and sacrifice are not the end of the story. The cross wasn't the finish line. Sacrifice leads somewhere. It leads to glory. Next, we're going to see how Paul turns the corner. Sacrifice ends in glory. We've seen how sacrifice begins with humility. We've seen how sacrifice deepens in obedience. But Paul doesn't stop there. If the story ended with a cradle and a carpenter's bench, it ended with Gethsemane and a Roman cross, right? Then we would only be left with a loss. If the story ended with a cradle and a carpenter's bench, if it ended with a Gethsemane and a Roman's cross, then we would only be left with loss. But sacrifice isn't the end of the story. Paul shows us in Philippians chapter 2, 9-11 that sacrifice ultimately ends in glory. It says this, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. That word therefore is huge, right? It's a turning point of the whole hymn because of his humility, because of his obedience, because he laid everything down, therefore God lifted him up. And Paul doesn't just say exalted, he says God super exalted him in the Greek, right? Raised beyond measure. Jesus wasn't simply restored to where he was before. He was lifted above every name, every ruler, every power, every authority. And the name given to him was Lord, Kyrios, right? The same title the Greek Old Testament used for Yahweh, the God of Israel. Man, this wasn't just a title. This was divine recognition. The Father stamped glory on the Son's obedience. Verse 10 says that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. And Paul's echoing here found in Isaiah 45:23, where it says, before me, every knee will bow, by me, every tongue will swear. That was Yahweh speaking in Isaiah. And now Paul applies those words directly to Jesus. That's powerful. Don't miss that, right? Every knee, every tongue, all creation in heaven, the angels bow. On earth, humanity bows. Under the earth, even the spiritual powers and the dead acknowledge him. This is the universal submission. Willingly or unwillingly, every knee bends. It continues here in verse 11. And every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The word acknowledge is strong, right? It's an open, joyful, unashamed confession. And what's being confessed here? That Jesus Christ is Lord. This was the earliest Christian creed. But saying those words in Philippi could get you killed. Why? Because only the Caesar was called Lord. Only Caesar was Kyrios. To confess Jesus is Lord, to confess that, was an act of costly defiance against Rome. It was to declare our loyalty is not to Caesar, not to the empire, but to Christ. And Paul says one day every tongue will confess that truth. Jesus will not just be seen as an option. He'll be proclaimed as Lord of all. And there's a pattern, right? Here's the pattern. Sacrifice leads to obedience, leads to glory. The cross comes before the crown. The cross comes before the crown. The lowering comes before the lifting. The sacrifice comes before the glory. And that's not just true for Jesus. Paul is saying that this is the pattern for us. For us individually, when obedience costs you your reputation, your comfort, or your dreams, God sees it. Your vindication may not come immediately, but it will come. For the church, when we choose sacrifice, like serving, forgiving, giving, the world sees Christ. Our power isn't pride, polish, or position. Our power is in humility, right? For eternity. Today, not everyone acknowledges Jesus. We can see that all around us. But one day, every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess. The sacrifice of Christ guarantees it. He does, right? Think about an athlete for a moment for a championship, right? They give up sleep, they give up their comfort, even meals, right? They sacrifice now for glory later. And when the medal is placed around their neck, every hour of pain is suddenly worth it. Or think about a student who's grinding through years of study, long nights, endless assignments, all the sacrifice, but when they walk across that stage and hear their name, the glory outweighs the cost. Now, those are obviously small pictures of a greater reality. For Jesus, the cross was the cost, right? And glory was the outcome. And so I have a challenge for you. What does that mean for us today? It means your sacrifice is never wasted. When you choose humility, God sees. When you obey, even when it costs, God honors it. When you lay down your pride, your comfort, your very life, God promises resurrection. Because sacrifice ends in glory. And that's the pattern, that's a Jesus way. And it means this for us. When we choose humility instead of pride, when we obey even when it costs, when we sacrifice even when it feels like we're losing, we can trust God with the outcome. Because here's the bottom line. Obedience that costs you something is never wasted. God turns it into glory.
That was so good, what Pastor Nate had to say. And as we close our time off together, let me leave you with these two questions. For those who already follow Jesus, here's a question. What step of sacrifice is he inviting you to take this week to walk more closely with him? And for those still searching, what's keeping you from saying yes to Jesus and discovering the life he offers? See, we'd love to walk with you wherever you are on that journey. And if you're here in the Miramichi area, we would love to have you attend each Sunday here in person. But ultimately, we'd love for you just to reach out, that we can pray for you, we can answer questions, and we can journey with you. So keep discovering God, keep taking steps to own your faith this week.